An unmarked grave in an overgrown cemetery holds the story of a Civil War corporal, as well as the history of an often forgotten historic Black community. To discuss that, we're joined by Dr. Irvin DePedro Cohen, Executive Director of LISC Jacksonville. Welcome.
Good morning.
Nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Also joined by Adonnica Toler, local historian and director of the Eartha M.M. White Museum. Welcome back, Adonnica.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
And we're also joined by Dr. Raymond Oldakowski, professor of geography at Jacksonville University. Good morning.
Good morning.
So, Dr. Cohen, let's start with this neighborhood and kind of how LISC Jacksonville got involved in this particular effort on this gravesite.
Well, I think we came along as part of a larger initiative that we have called Operation Final Hours. And it's our effort to provide headstones for loved ones in unmarked graves throughout Northeast Florida. And so I think we were probably the last entry into the party, but nonetheless, we are glad to be there.
So that's actually kind of a tall order in Jacksonville. There are a lot of grave sites that have been neglected over the years, or whoever owned them has moved on and they're not well tended sometimes.
Well, for us, it was really about our effort to, in the communities that we work in, to provide access to VA programs for those residents that lived in those neighborhoods who were part of our military. And so that's how Operation Final Hours came about. And so when we heard about this effort with JU and UNF, it just kind of made sense for us to be involved in the process.
And I want to talk about that. But for people who aren't familiar with LISC Jacksonville, you've been on before, but just give us a brief explainer of the work that you do.
So LISC is an acronym for Local Initiative Support Corporation, and we are a financial and social intermediary. And what that means is we bring resources and programmatic offerings to some of our most under-resourced communities throughout our city.
Okay.
And we've been doing it now for the last 25 years.
Adonnica Toler, this grave site has been getting a lot of attention because of this effort to put a new marker on the site. But it has also helped bring attention to an area of Arlington that is not widely known sometimes for the historic Black communities really that were there. What was there prior to the modern day of, kind of the university and then the surrounding neighborhoods, suburbans?
So actually, that area, people would be surprised to know, was owned by African Americans or former enslaved. And a big part of what is JU's property, one of the daughters of Anna Kingsley, that actually was her property. So that whole area, and even further around, Anna Kingsley herself had property. And so rolling around to Cosmo that we're talking about, some of the descendants of Anna Kingsley are residents of the Cosmos area, as well as those coming from the St. George Sea Islands in South Carolina, coming to settle in that area.
And remind us, Anna Kingsley, not everybody will know her name.
So Anna Jai Kingsley was the wife of Kingsley Plantation, Zephaniah Kingsley, I can think of it. Zephaniah Kingsley, he actually bought her as a slave in Senegal. He later married her, and she actually was his primary wife, and married her in an era where it was totally illegal to do that, but he did it, and she actually ran the plantation, and at least three or four of the kids had plantations around the state of Florida. When the Spanish lost control of Florida and the English were going to take over, Kingsleys went to what is now Dominican Republic and settled there. And there are descendants there today.
And there is not a lot left of that historic neighborhood. Explain to us what happened. I mean, it's, I think, all too common a story, particularly when we're talking about those freed slaves, or people who were living in those communities after the Civil War.
Well, it happens what we would call gentrification or urban removal. So areas that slither of land now is about between two subdivisions. And if you're familiar, it's in the Fort Caroline area. If you're familiar, and the post office that's there, that's the easiest marker for me. It's like kind of behind that in that smaller area.
And these properties kind of ran back from the river, or the part of the river
Correct.
that's known as Mill Cove, right?
Yes.
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 And they were very long, narrow passages of
Mm-hmm.
property.
Great way of income, taking care of your family, all of those things. But slowly and surely, property being grown and developing. Because you imagine it is out in the country, in the deep, not in the city. And so they were living in and enjoying the water. And especially those who came from South Carolina and Georgia, they are used to the water. So that living on the water was an easier way of life. And some of them actually traveled by the water, by the banks to get to the area. So
But that land became very valuable as
became very valuable as
Mhm.
time moved on. And so they have been fighting and they still continue to fight to preserve their legacy, preserve there's only a few buildings left, but definitely a conversation that you should have later with the Levon White, who's the president of the Cosmo Historic Preservation Group. Definitely someone to talk with and get even more in-depth information, because they do have records of families where they were located. And I forgot the city council member that helped with the park that's there. Fair, I can't remember the name, but there's a city council member that actually helped them do a freedom park. So forgive me for not remembering your name right now. But so there is effort by the city and the state to preserve these historic places.
Dr. Raymond Oldakowski, I want to bring you into this conversation. You helped lead this effort to replace a headstone for the grave of Civil War veteran Corporal William Johnson. He was a Black Civil War veteran. Why was this effort undertaken, and why was JU involved?
I was approached by Dr. Craig Bettinger, who's a professor of history here at JU, and he had gotten in touch with Christopher Smith, who's a the community development program officer at LISC, and had found out about the Operation Final Honors. And I guess the year before I got here in 1989, they had a small recognition when they initially found the gravestone of Corporal Johnson, and the gravestone was propped up in that cemetery area, but then it was stolen soon after that, and nothing had really happened for the next 30 years. Dr. Bettinger had told me that they had made some attempts to get in touch with the Veterans Administration to get a replacement headstone, but at that time they were told that only direct descendants of Corporal Johnson could apply for a headstone. And then I sort of worked together. I decided that we should contact Congressman Bean's office. He's a alumni of JU. Spoke to Christopher. He had gotten in touch with the UNF Digital Humanities Institute.
Christopher from LISC.
Christopher Smith from LISC, yes. And he had gotten in touch with the UNF Digital Humanities Institute. They got some pension records for Corporal Johnson. We worked together with the Florida Department of Veterans Affairs, and got a VA staffer, Brandon Washington, who helped shepherd the application through. And then I guess it was March of this year that LISC received the replacement headstone.
And so this, for people who aren't maybe able to visualize where this cemetery is relative to the JU property, explain to us where it is and kind of the condition that it's in.
Sure. Actually, we should give a shout out to the property appraiser's office as well. They helped us with trying to figure out who actually owns the property. It is a small lot, probably about 20 yards by 40 yards, located right off of University Boulevard, between the road and a warehouse that we have here on the campus. It's just a typical piece of North Florida undeveloped land, unlandscaped land. It's just sort of the natural setting there. And I guess when they initially discovered the first headstone back in 1989, they put a small kind of passive fence, just a few wood posts with a chain along it and a gate. And our physical maintenance plant persons had told us that they had been given instructions a long time ago to passively maintain the area, that there would be no mowing, no chemicals or fertilizers or that sort of thing, because it was a cemetery.
And so, given that it's kind of in that rough Florida state, where are you going to put the headstone?
Well, what we are doing, again, LISC and JU have gotten together with Haskell. They have provided some preliminary work on designing a little sacred space that we could define with a more formal fence, a walkway that would make it possible for people to go in and out of the area, a gazebo, some benches, that sort of thing, so that it's something that we would welcome folks to be able to look at Corporal Johnson's headstone and sort of other placards that would honor the other folks that are buried there.
And you mentioned Haskell. That's the Haskell Company. They're a local engineering, large engineering company here. Why? How did they get involved?
I believe LISC had contacted them in trying to, move us to the next step.
I gotcha. And Dr.
Right.
Cohen, you're nodding.
Yes, that's exactly how they got involved in the process. We wanted to make sure that the design of the area where Corporal Johnson is buried was reflective of something we wanted our community to be proud of. And so we reached out to a few people, and Haskell has stepped up and said they will be more than happy to help us design an area that would be reflective of that.
And Adonnica, this headstone, as Dr. Oldakowski alluded to, had been discovered back in 1989, and then the campus newspaper wrote a story about it, it profiling the corporal and what we knew of him, what they knew of him at that time, and soon thereafter, the headstone went missing. That's an all too common, I think, circumstance when you have, relics of the past, or perhaps even more recently. I think we can remember when a memorial in St. Johns County went missing soon after its dedication, commemorating a lynching that occurred there.
Yeah, that's very interesting that someone would take it, but you're right. And when you think about what we think about cemeteries, they're sacred, and especially for someone like Corporal Johnson, who gave his life for freedom, what we talk about in the United States, that someone would take his marker and have no problem taking it. And I'm not sure why they would have done that. I mean, maybe they didn't want his memory to be reflective. And that's what's really important about cemeteries, especially African American cemeteries. There's history in those places. And as I looked in Corporal William Johnson's story a little bit, he very well may have known Lafayette White, who married Clara White, who is Eartha White's parents, or her parents. So it's very possible that there's a connection between those, and they're a very important part of American history in preserving freedom that we so enjoy and that we so long to have here in this country.
And that connection, you mentioned Clara White. She's obviously a well-known name for the Clara White Mission, which her daughter named after her. But she was an instrumental figure in helping people who had recently left slavery,
Correct,
to stay fed, really, and to
Correct.
stay housed. And her relationship with Lafayette White was that she later married.
She later married him. Clara was a nurse and a cook in the Civil War, and she served the 33rd and the 34th, which is where Lafayette and Johnson were respectively. And after the war, she was a big figure in making sure veterans were settled, that they had a place to be. So I'm wondering, did she know him? Did she help settle him there, or just did she keep in touch with him after the war? Did they go visit? So now my imagination is running wild, which also gives you context, and it gives you these were real people, and not just some figure we're learning about. It's not just a marker. It represents a life and a community.
So he was Corporal Johnson was in the 33rd Infantry, and
Lafayette was in the 34th.
Lafayette was
and they moved together. When they went to battle.
Gotcha. Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the history of the Cosmo neighborhood and efforts to restore a nearby African American cemetery. You can join our conversation live on air by giving us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. We have a call. Good morning, Stanley. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning to Ann and my good friend Pedro. Yes, great job. And to the rest of the guests, y'all doing a fantastic job. But when we talk about that area, especially over on this part of the United States, those are Gullah Geechee people. We've been here over 15,000 years. But we used to own all this property, especially when we talk about Jacksonville for a period of time. And Jacksonville only been around about 201 years. But African Americans have participated in the wars for over 200 years, and there's should be plenty market. No, I'm sorry, still moaning. I'm sorry, but there's plenty opportunity by the African American community that they need to put the history out there, because we have a vast history in Jacksonville. I'm talking about African American veterans. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Stanley. Appreciate it. Dr. Cohen. Go ahead.
It's
Yes.
ironic because in preparing for this, what I found is that the 2021 statewide study conducted by the Task Force on Abandoned African American Cemeteries suggested that 30 to 40% of the cemeteries that primarily housed African American deceased were unmarked. And so that really led us to really start this body of work. And then I think secondly, and just as important, is this notion of history. It's important to tell history in an unadulterated, unsanitized way. It may not be nice, it may not be pleasant, but it's still nonetheless our history. And that's why it's important for us to tell the story in a way that sometimes, quite frankly, will make some people feel uncomfortable.
Sure. Yeah. It's an uncomfortable history. Dr. Cohen, you also do something at LISC that's called not placemaking, but creative placekeeping.
Right.
Explain to us what that is and how this this area ties into that effort.
For us, creative placekeeping recognizes the history of the place that we're going into. I'm not necessarily a big fan of this idea of creative placemaking because it assumes that you're going in to make something that wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done is we've approached this work recognizing the history and all of the things that were in existence before we got there. We are just there to really, I always say put some earrings on the situation and maybe put some makeup on the situation. But we're not there to disrupt the history of what's already happened in those communities. And so we've approached our work as part of our larger strategic plan is creative placekeeping as very essential. And what this body of work recognizes, what this area had a history. We are there to find out what that history is and then accentuate what's already on the ground.
Can you talk about some other communities where LISC has been doing that kind of work and what we can see from it?
Sure. I mean, if you go into any of the LISC-supported neighborhoods north of our city, creative placekeeping is what we really lean into. The area along the Reba River, that's creative placekeeping. Again, and this work of finding Corporal Johnson's gravesite really allows us to lean into our work around heirs property. As we go into neighborhoods and we find out there are veterans that are living in these communities and their families don't necessarily have access or know that they have access to VA programs, it allows us to do that work. And we do it in a way that recognizes the almost sanctity of what's happening on the ground and recognizing the indigenous people to those communities and how do we support them with the work that we're doing. Our home repair, our heirs property work, Project Boots, all of those things recognizes that there are communities that are already intact, and how do we support people on the ground.
Dr. Oldakowski, I want to ask, since there was a prior headstone that was, at this grave site that was removed or stolen, what is the plan to make sure that that doesn't happen in this case and that it's protected?
Yeah, that's a good question. Number one, when we had the ceremony a few weeks ago, or last week, we brought the headstone to a central community area, river house on JU's campus to display it. We did not put it in the cemetery area, but it is solid granite. It is very heavy and would obviously be anchored into the ground. And I would suspect we have not made any sorts of plans yet with our security office here at JU, but the area would be patrolled and lit and that sort of thing as well. But as you mentioned, it's something to be concerned about because, like we said, it's right off of University Boulevard.
It seems that there is a increased awareness by educational institutions, higher education, to reckon with, its history and its past. At my own alma mater at the University of Wisconsin, I know they've been really doing a lot more in terms of the indigenous people that once lived there and recognizing that. Is there any sense that JU, larger than just this cemetery, is looking at the history of the property and where it came from, who it belonged to, along the river there in that stretch that we're discussing?
Yes, our DEI office has already put out statements about the land ownership of the area before the university came here. There are Native American burial grounds that are on the campus areas as well. The Delius House is part of JU's infrastructure, so it's part of our campus history as well. And we do try to get the students involved in all of these activities so that they're aware of the fact that this land has not been Jacksonville University. Actually, just for the last 90 years is how long we've been here, and there's a long history before it.
Right. And you mentioned your DEI office. We should point out JU is a private institution. It's why it's allowed to have a DEI office while state schools no longer are. But that sort of speaks to what Dr. Cohen was saying in terms of, learning about this history, Adonnica, and recognizing even painful parts of it.
Correct. And the painful brings out the good as well. And so, but it's very important that we know our history. It's very important to just know where we are and then deal with whatever the consequences are. And we've all come through challenging situations in our life. We have it now. And our American history is that it's very complicated. It's not one-sided. It's very shaded. So slavery was a terrible institution, but some powerful people came out of that and it made a change. When you talk about Harriet Tubman, when you talk about Clara White, and the impact they had coming out of that institution, they still impacted and they blessed the community. So it's important that we know what the history is, even if it's painful, so that we can know how strong we are and make sure we don't make the same mistakes again.
Dr. Oldakowski, it seemed like there was an interesting parallel that you all drew between the work that JU and its partners in this case formed to try to get this new headstone and what had happened initially when 130 years ago there was kind of a group effort to get a headstone for Corporal Johnson. Can you tell us about that parallel?
I wish I could. That is more Dr. Bettinger's area of expertise. So as a matter of fact, that's what he spoke about when he gave a few remarks at the ceremony last time, how it was a community effort. I guess Corporal Johnson and his wife both needed assistance in filling out the paperwork and being able to actually get his veterans benefits and then to obtain the headstone back in the 1800s.
Dr. Cohen, why is it important that this be a group effort in this case?
Well, I think it's because it's bigger than one organization. And I think that, that's how we truly stand in as a community and do this thing collectively. I don't think this work is reflective of one organization. And I think this is a perfect example of how we move humanity forward when we all join together and don't place this burden on one entity to get done. And so I'm very happy to have, my organization work with JU. I'm happy to have my organization work with UNF to advance this cause forward.
And how important is it to have somebody like Representative, having Aaron Bean participate in this as a lawmaker? Do you think that kind of furthers the discussion with a legislature that has been, hot and cold when it comes to issues of teaching certainly Black history in this state.
Well, I think it says that the work that we're doing is not necessarily political. And I think it shows that we have the capacity to see beyond any political differences to advance a larger cause forward. And so it also suggests to me that, not only were there, white soldiers during the Civil War, but there were Black soldiers as well. And so Corporal Johnson's is a perfect example of his story coming to light, and Congressman Bean's support of us helping to get the gravestone says that the issue is bigger than politics, and there are still those things that in our society we can have civil discussions around. There's still those things in our society that we can all collectively wrap our arms around to advance the cause forward. And I'm very, very, very happy that Representative Bean leaned in to help us get this done.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for being here, Dr. Raymond Oldakowski, Dr. DePedro Cohen, Adonnica Toler. A good conversation. I appreciate all of